the cannibal feast of Alfred Packer. The snow was unrelenting in the Rocky Mountains during the winter of 1874, piling up in silent, suffocating layers over the Colorado frontier. Among the prospectors chasing dreams of gold, one man's name would later be whispered with unease, his story softened, altered, or sometimes omitted entirely from local retellings: Alfred Packer. What began as a desperate journey through the wilderness became a tale of survival, cannibalism, and cover-up so disturbing that 19th century America tried, in many ways, to push it out of sight. Packer had set out with 5 others in search of fortune. The San Juan Mountains, dazzling in summer, were merciless in winter. Food ran short. The men, cut off from supply lines and rescue, entered a realm of starvation where the body weakens, the mind frays, and morality bends. Weeks later, when Packer stumbled into a nearby settlement alone, gaunt and shaking, he claimed his companions had abandoned him. Yet when a thaw revealed the bodies, what settlers found was far darker: his 5 comrades, butchered and partially consumed. The mainstream fact is clear. Packer was arrested and stood trial in 1874, accused of murdering his companions and eating them to survive. Newspapers pounced on the grotesque tale, dubbing him the Colorado Cannibal. His testimony shifted over time, first insisting he killed only one in self-defense, later admitting to consuming flesh after their deaths. At his sentencing, the judge's words became infamous. "You man-eating son of a..." The transcript trailed, leaving historians to debate whether it was censored even then. But fringe tidbits cling to the edges of this story. Some frontier ballads celebrated him darkly, making Packer into a folk figure. University students in Boulder, Colorado eventually named a cafeteria in his honor, the Alfred Packer Grill, a macabre joke. Yes, but also an odd form of cultural memory, turning tragedy into a caricature, as though joking might contain its horror. And curiously, Packer spelled his name with an E, yet his tombstone reads Alfred. Scholars still debate whether this was a mistake or another attempt to blur his presence in official record. The trial itself raises questions that remain unresolved. Was Packer truly the murderer of all 5 men, or only the last desperate survivor among corpses? Skeletal evidence examined decades later hinted at multiple weapon strikes, suggesting more than one man may have resorted to violence. Scholars still debate whether Packer was a cold-blooded killer who eliminated companions to preserve himself, or simply a man driven to an unthinkable act by starvation. Even in modern retellings, there's an uneasiness about giving the story too much space. Frontier mythology prefers heroic miners, noble sheriffs, and stern pioneers, not starving men carving flesh from their neighbors. And so, for generations, families in Colorado avoided the tale at bedtime. Newspapers downplayed it after the trial, and the mountains themselves held the silence. Yet the snow that winter and the bones left behind did not forget. The disturbing truth beneath the legend is that survival, at its most brutal edge, often erases the fine lines we imagine between civilization and savagery. Packer's name lingers precisely because it was uncomfortable, too dark to fully honor, too human to fully deny. Babylon's forgotten blood rituals. At first glance, Babylon gleams in our imagination as a place of marvels, the hanging gardens, the ziggurat of Etemenanke, the ordered brilliance of Mesopotamian law under Hammurabi. Yet beneath this shining facade, travellers and chroniclers whispered of practices so unsettling that later rulers tried to erase or sanitize them. Among these were the rituals of blood, ceremonies the city performed in secret corners of its temples, far from the polished image Babylon wanted to project to the wider world. We know from mainstream sources that Babylon's religion centered around mighty gods like Marduk and Ishtar. Public festivals were lavish and highly visible, involving processions, music, and sacrifice. Animals were the usual victims: bulls, goats, doves, all meant to nourish the gods through smoke rising to heaven. Yet hidden among these rites were stranger, more troubling accounts. Rituals where blood itself, drawn not from beasts but from people, may have been the medium of divine communion. Herodotus, the Greek historian of the 5th century BCE, left tantalizing, if problematic, testimony. He described practices in Babylon that included temple prostitution and the offering of human lives. His words must be handled with care. Herodotus often blended rumour with observation, but other fragmentary sources support the idea that Babylon was not above human sacrifice in extreme circumstances. One particularly haunting tale describes prisoners of war drained of blood and buried beneath foundations of new temples, as if their vitality could strengthen the rising bricks. A quirky tidbit survives in local Mesopotamian lore. Some priests allegedly mixed a few drops of blood with wine or honey, creating what they believed to be a conduit between mortals and the divine. This detail, preserved only in fringe accounts, sounds more like alchemy than liturgy, yet it hints at the fascination Babylon had with blood as essence, life concentrated into liquid. Scholars still debate whether these blood rites were real, exaggerated by rivals, or symbolic gestures later misunderstood. Was the blood actually consumed, or was it merely smeared on temple walls and idols? Were victims truly killed, or did rituals involve symbolic wounding, like a staged theatre of suffering? Without clear archaeological proof, the matter remains murky. Excavations at sites such as and Sippar reveal animal sacrifice in abundance, but only hints of human involvement, and yet the stories persist. The cover-up, if we may call it that, came later. Under Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon sought to portray itself as the jewel of the ancient world, a city of gardens, astronomy, and law. Accounts of blood-drinking priests and temple murders would have clashed with that cultivated image. Much like modern empires managing their public relations, Babylon elevated its wonders while burying the darker stories. But every so often, in cuneiform tablets or hostile foreign writings, the shadows flicker back. Babylon's splendour rested, in part, on rituals that unsettled even their neighbours, and perhaps that is why the city's legacy has always felt tinged with menace, a place of order and brilliance, yes, but also a place where the gods were thought to thirst for more than incense. The oracle's poisoned breath. High in the mountains of central Greece, at the foot of Mount Parnassus, lay the sanctuary of Delphi. Here pilgrims came from across the Mediterranean to ask questions of the gods, for the oracle of Apollo was believed to speak divine truth. Kings and generals, farmers and philosophers all came to sit before the Pythia, the priestess whose trance-like visions could alter the fate of nations. Yet behind this sacred aura lurked a disturbing reality. The very source of her prophecy may not have been divine inspiration at all, but poisoned breath rising from the earth. Mainstream accounts describe the Pythia as entering a frenzied state while perched upon a tripod over a fissure in the temple floor. She inhaled vapours said to come from the god Apollo himself. Words spilled from her lips in wild utterances, later interpreted by priests into riddling prophecies. Some of history's most consequential choices, whether to go to war, when to found a colony, how to appease the gods, were shaped by these cryptic responses. Croesus of Lydia famously misread the oracle's words and marched to his ruin. For centuries, skeptics doubted whether the vapours existed at all. The French excavations of Delphi in the 19th century uncovered no obvious fissures beneath the temple. Scholars dismissed the ancient reports as metaphorical, concluding the priestess's trances were more likely induced by fasting, laurel chewing, or self-hypnosis. The divine breath was explained away. And then, in the late 20th century, geology brought the mystery back. Researchers discovered that two fault lines intersect directly beneath the temple. Traces of ethylene gas, a mildly sweet-smelling narcotic vapour, were found in the surrounding rock. Inhaling it in enclosed spaces could indeed cause euphoria, hallucinations, even seizures. It seemed Apollo's breath was geological, not divey, nay. A quirky tidbit underscores how precarious this arrangement was. Some ancient writers noted that a Pythia could die if she inhaled too much. One priestess, forced into service despite her age, allegedly collapsed during prophecy, choking on fumes. Her death was quietly written off as the god's will. In a sense, Apollo was devouring his own mouthpiece. Scholars still debate whether the gases were strong enough or even present in consistent concentrations to truly cause such visions. Some argue that the ethylene theory fits neatly but relies on modern imagination. Others maintain that ritual and suggestion alone could have induced the trance. Yet the possibility that generations of prophecies, the very foundations of Greek political and cultural choices, were guided by toxic vapours remains deeply unsettling. The cover-up was more subtle than erasure. Ancient priests emphasized the sanctity of the oracle, not its mechanism. To reveal that Apollo's voice came through a narcotic haze would have stripped Delphi of its awe. Even today, tourism brochures highlight the temple's grandeur, not the fact that the world's most famous seer may have been high on geological fumes. So we remember Delphi as the navel of the world, a place where gods spoke to mortals. But beneath that poetry lies a harsher truth. Nations may have risen and fallen on the breath of the earth itself, sweet and poisonous, curling up from the stone to whisper fate into human ears. Egypt's damned pharaoh Akhenaten. In the endless sands of Egypt's Nile Valley, pharaohs built their legacies in granite and gold. Yet one ruler's name was deliberately chipped from the stone, his monuments dismantled, his memory struck from the king lists. That ruler was Akhenaten, the so-called heretic king. His reign in the 14th century BCE reshaped Egypt's religion, art and politics so drastically that his successors tried to erase every trace. Beneath the surface of his reforms lay disturbing elements that Egyptians themselves sought to bury. Mainstream history records Akhenaten as the pharaoh who elevated a single deity, the Aten, the sun disk, above Egypt's traditional gods. For nearly 2 decades, he forced worshippers to abandon temples of Amun, Ra, and Osiris, insisting that all devotion flow to the radiant Aten. He moved the capital to a new city, Akhetaten, modern Amarna, filled with open courtyards where the sun's rays bathed worshippers. To later Egyptians, this was not piety, but desecration, one man's obsessive devotion undermining the balance of the cosmos. The art of his reign was equally unsettling. While earlier pharaohs were depicted as statuesque and godlike, Akhenaten's images showed him with elongated limbs, narrow face, swollen belly, and almost feminine features. His queen, Nefertiti, appeared with similar exaggerations. Some scholars suggest a medical explanation, perhaps Marfan syndrome or hormonal imbalance, but others see deliberate symbolism. By portraying himself as both male and female, Akhenaten embodied the Atene's universality. To traditionalists, however, this was grotesque, even blasphemous. A quirky tidbit: centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered Amarna, they found intimate hymns to Aten carved into walls, reading almost like love songs. In them, Aten is praised not as a distant cosmic power, but as a tender parent, cradling sea. Reation. For Egyptians accustomed to a vast pantheon of specialized gods, this language may have seemed disturbingly personal, unsettlingly exclusive. It was as if Akhenaten had rewritten the entire divine order into a private relationship between himself and a single celestial flame. The true reason for the cover-up may lie in politics as much as religion. By abolishing the cult of Amun, Akhenaten stripped priests of immense wealth and power. When he died, those priests, along with military leaders, restored the old order with ruthless efficiency. The boy king who followed, Tutankhaten, was renamed Tutankhamun, a deliberate re-allegiance to Amun. Decrees were issued condemning Akhenaten as the criminal of Akhetaten. His city was abandoned, his statues smashed, his name omitted from king lists. Scholars still debate whether Akhenaten should be remembered as history's first monotheist, a visionary centuries ahead of his time, or as a tyrant who destabilized Egypt for personal obsession. Was he a proto-prophet, or merely a zealot who endangered his kingdom? The ambiguity has kept his story hovering in that uneasy place between revelation and heresy. In popular culture, Egypt is remembered for its continuity: the pyramids, the gods, the golden mask of Tutankhamun. Akhenaten does not fit that story. His reign was disturbing not because of bloodshed, but because of erasure, a civilization so intent on continuity that it chose to annihilate a king's memory. And in that silence, the desert winds carried away the heretic's voice, until archaeologists, thousands of years later, brushed the sand away to find him staring back with alien eyes. Sparta's secret child cullings. Sparta looms in our imagination as the city of iron discipline, where warriors were bred from birth and legends like Thermopylae were forged in blood. Yet behind the polished myth of valour lies a disturbing practice that later storytellers chose to downplay or bury: the selective culling of newborns. In a society that worshipped strength above all, weakness was not tolerated, even in infants. Mainstream accounts, preserved by writers like Plutarch, centuries after Sparta's prime, tell us that when a Spartan child was born, the father did not decide its fate. Instead, the infant was presented to a council of elders. If the baby was deemed strong, it was returned to the family to be raised. If weak, deformed or sickly, the child was abandoned, reportedly left at the foot of Mount Taygetus to die of exposure. To the Spartans, this was not cruelty, but civic duty. A polis devoted to perpetual war could not afford to nurture fragility. The disturbing detail is how normalized this was. Unlike other Greek states that practiced infanticide in secret, Sparta institutionalized it as law. In later centuries, when Greece's intellectuals praised Sparta's austerity and order, they often glossed over these rituals. It was easier to glorify Spartan warriors than to confront the quiet wails of unwanted children left to the cold stones. Archaeology, however, complicates the story. Excavations at the so-called apothetai near Mount Taygetus, the site where children were said to have been thrown, found no mass graves of infants. Instead, bones there belonged mostly to older teenagers and adults. A quirky tidbit arises here. Some scholars suggest that rather than infants, this pit may have been used for traitors, criminals, or even executed prisoners of war. This casts doubt on the traditional narrative, raising the question of whether Spartan child culling as systematic as later writers claimed. And so the debate continues. Scholars still debate whether the abandonment of weak infants was widespread Spartan practice or exaggerated propaganda by rivals like Athens, eager to paint Sparta as brutal. It may be that some children were left to die, but others perhaps quietly adopted into slavery or fostered away from the city. The truth remains elusive, hidden behind centuries of myth-making. What cannot be denied is the psychological imprint. From the age of 7, Spartan boys entered the agoge, a brutal training system designed to toughen them into soldiers. The society that may have culled its weak at birth certainly moulded its survivors into instruments of war. The absence of compassion in infancy prepared the ground for its absence in adulthood. The cover-up, or at least the softening, came later. European admirers of Sparta during the Renaissance and Enlightenment praised its civic virtue, often omitting the shadows. Even today, popular films and retellings of Spartan glory rarely linger on the infants left by Taygetus. Heroism is easier to digest when stripped of its disturbing roots, and so Sparta's legend shines bright, burnished by stories of 300 warriors standing against Persia. Yet at its foundations lies a silence filled by the cries of those who never grew to bear shield or spear. The Spartan miracle, so often admired, was built upon a threshold where only the strongest were allowed to cross. Rome's festival of human sacrifice. Rome's legacy is often framed as one of law, roads, and empire, an orderly civilization that prided itself on sophistication over barbarism. Yet hidden beneath this polished self-image were moments when the eternal city dipped into rituals so disturbing that later generations sought to suppress or reframe them. Among these were acts of human sacrifice, woven into Rome's festivals and crises, and later concealed beneath the cloak of myth and euphemism. Mainstream accounts remind us that Rome officially outlawed human sacrifice by the 2nd century BCE. Cicero, in his writings, claimed such practices were unworthy of civilized Rome, and yet evidence suggests the reality was not so simple. During dire emergencies, foreign invasions, plagues, ominous signs, the Senate authorized extraordinary rituals. Livy, the historian, records one of the most chilling. In 216 BCE, after Hannibal's devastating victory at Cannae, 2 pairs of Gauls and Greeks were buried alive in the Forum Boarium, Rome's cattle market, as a desperate offering to the gods of the underworld. The disturbing detail lies not just in the act itself, but in how carefully it was hidden. The victims were entombed in a stone chamber underground, with no markers above. Rome wanted the ritual's effect, but not its memory. To a city that prided itself on rational governance, the acknowledgement of such primitive blood rites was deeply embarrassing. Quirky tidbits slip through the cracks. One source suggests that during the festival of Saturnalia, later remembered only as a season of feasting and misrule, there may once have been darker roots. Saturn, after all, was a god associated with devouring his own children. While by the classical period Saturnalia had become merriment and gift-giving, some antiquarians whispered that in its earliest form human lives may have been offered along side animals, only later replaced by symbolic effigies. Whether true or not, this suggestion haunted Rome's cultural memory. The most famous echo of human sacrifice in Rome is the gladiatorial games themselves. Originally staged as funerary rites, these combats were framed as blood offerings to honor the dead. Over time, they evolved into entertainment, but their roots lay in the same logic as ritual killing, the spilling of blood to appease powers beyond the living. Scholars still debate whether gladiators were consciously understood as substitutes for sacrificial victims, or whether that connection was quietly brushed aside as the games became a national obsession. The cover-up is visible in Rome's own storytelling. Official inscriptions and state propaganda emphasized Rome's piety, discipline, and civic virtue, not its moments of blood-soaked desperation. Later writers insisted human sacrifice had been abolished early, pushing uncomfortable accounts into footnotes of history. By the imperial period, Romans contrasted their civilized empire against the barbaric Gauls or Carthaginians, ignoring that Rome itself had once performed the same dark rites. What lingers is the unsettling reminder that even civilizations we call advanced were not immune to the pull of blood rituals. Rome, in its darkest hours, turned to the same logic as Babylon or Carthage, that the gods required life for life, breath for breath, and when the crisis passed, Rome covered the chamber with stone, walked away, and pretended the screams had never echoed beneath the cattle market. The Aztec skin wearers of Totec in the great temples of Tenochtitlan, where stone pyramids rose like stairways to the heavens, the Aztecs enacted ceremonies that both awed and horrified their neighbours. Among the most unsettling was the festival of Totec, the flayed lord. This god, associated with renewal, agriculture and rebirth, demanded offerings that mirrored the shedding of old skin. Priests did not simply kill their victims, they wore their flesh. Mainstream history tells us that during the annual spring festival, captives were sacrificed to Totec in rituals that mirrored the cycles of planting and harvest. Their skin, peeled away in strips, was donned by priests who then walked among the people, their new clothes symbolizing fertility and the renewal of life. Just as corn sheds its husk to sprout new growth, so too, the Aztecs believed, must humanity offer skin to nourish the gods. The disturbing detail is in the intimacy of the act. These skin suits were worn for days, sometimes until the flesh rotted and fell away, symbolizing decay giving way to new life. Ordinary citizens were expected to greet these walking effigies, not with horror but with reverence, for they embodied the god himself. Children were encouraged to touch the dangling strips of flesh, believing blessings would pass through the contact. A quirky tidbit preserved in codices tells of how some priests, after the ceremony, would sit at banquets, still wearing their gruesome attire, feasting in honor of the god. Others traded the skins like garments, ensuring that more members of the priesthood could participate in Totec's embodiment. The Spanish conquistadors, when they first witnessed these rites, were so unsettled that they described them as satanic, yet to the Aztecs they were sacred theatre, woven into the agricultural rhythm of their world. Archaeology has confirmed fragments of this unsettling festival. Sculptures of Totec depict him unmistakably, a figure with a second face peering through the mouth of a flayed mask. In 2019, excavations in Mexico City uncovered a temple dedicated to him, lined with carved skulls and ceremonial knives, physical proof of rites that, until then, had lingered half in myth. Scholars still debate whether the skins were always taken from sacrificial victims or sometimes fashioned from animal hides to substitute in lean years. Some argue the practice was more symbolic than literal, exaggerated by Spanish chroniclers to vilify the Aztecs. Others counter that archaeological evidence shows clear traces of large-scale human sacrifice linked to the festival. The truth, as so often, is layered like the skins themselves, ritual, symbol, and horror combined. The cover-up came later, under colonial rule. Spanish missionaries, horrified, destroyed temples and burned codices, eager to erase Totec's worship from memory. Yet traces survived in fragments of indigenous storytelling where the flayed god remained a symbol of agricultural renewal, stripped of his bloodier associations. In the modern era, when Mexico embraces its Aztec heritage, these darker rituals are mentioned only in passing, overshadowed by more palatable images of pyramids and calendars. Still, the story lingers. Behind the grandeur of Aztec civilization lies this haunting image: priests walking the streets, clothed in another's skin, embodying a god whose renewal required the rawest sacrifice of all. The Carthaginian child fires. On the coast of North Africa, Carthage rose as a mighty power, rivaling Rome for mastery of the Mediterranean. Known for its ships, its wealth, and its brilliant generals like Hannibal, the city has long fascinated historians. Yet beneath the glory of empire lies one of antiquity's most disturbing accusations, that the Carthaginians sacrificed their own children, burning infants alive to appease their god Baal-Hamon. Whether propaganda or truth, the shadow of these child fires clings to Carthage's memory. Mainstream sources leave us with stark accounts. Greek and Roman writers such as Diodorus Siculus, Plutarch, and Tertullian described rituals in which children, often the offspring of nobility, were placed upon the outstretched bronze hands of a great idol of Baal or Tanit. The flames below consumed them while drums and flutes drowned out their cries. These sacrifices, they said, were acts of desperation in times of plague, famine, or war, an exchange of innocent lives for divine favour. The disturbing detail is how systematic this appears to have been. Ancient chroniclers claimed Carthage maintained a special precinct, the Tophet, where thousands of urns filled with the ashes of children were buried beneath stelae carved with religious symbols. Excavations beginning in the 1920s uncovered precisely such a site. The Tophet of Carthage revealed layer upon layer of small urns, each containing charred remains of infants or very young animals, sometimes side by side. And yet the evidence is not straightforward. A quirky tidbit from archaeology complicates the narrative. Some urns contain lamb or bird remains instead of children, suggesting that animal substitution may have been practiced. Moreover, some bones appear to show infants who died naturally, perhaps buried in a sacred precinct rather than sacrificed. Was the Tophet a cemetery for our babies who died in infancy, as some modern scholars argue, or truly a place of ritual burning? Scholars still debate whether the Romans exaggerated the story to demonize their enemy. Rome, after all, had every incentive to cast Carthage as monstrous, especially after the brutality of the Punic Wars. The thought of Carthaginians feeding their own children to flames gave Rome the moral high ground to destroy the city utterly in 146 BCE, sowing its ruins with salt and declaring its memory cursed. Yet the archaeological silence is uneasy. Too many urns, too much charred bone, too much alignment with ancient descriptions. The truth may lie in between, that Carthage did sometimes sacrifice children, especially in moments of civic crisis, while in other cases the Tophet functioned as a ritual burial ground for natural deaths. The cover-up unfolded in layers. The Romans destroyed Carthage, ensuring that no Carthaginian voices could explain their own practices. Later histories preferred to remember Hannibal's elephants rather than fires of infants. Modern Tunis, built upon ancient Carthage, has little interest in branding itself with a story of child sacrifice, and so the flames remain half-seen, flickering between archaeology and propaganda. But once heard, the image cannot be shaken. Bronze hands outstretched, fire leaping, the cries of children silenced by the pounding of drums. Whether fully true or partly exaggerated, it is one of the most haunting accusations of the ancient world, too disturbing for Carthage's admirers to embrace, too compelling for history to forget. The Viking blood eagle. In the sagas of the north, where longships cut across steel-grey seas and mead halls echoed with boasts of glory, there is whispered one execution so grotesque that even the Vikings themselves spoke of it with unease. The blood eagle. A ritual killing reserved for traitors or the most hated enemies, it combined brutality with symbolism, its details so ghastly that scholars have long debated whether it was ever truly done, or if it was merely the invention of poets seeking to terrify. Mainstream accounts come from medieval sagas written centuries after the Viking Age. They describe how a condemned man was seized, his ribs cut open along the spine, and his lungs pulled outward through the back so they spread like wings. The victim was said to still be alive as this was done, gasping for air with lungs exposed to the cold air, while the executioners proclaimed it a sacrifice to Odin. In this way, the victim was transformed grotesquely into an eagle, a symbol of divine offering and martial honour. The disturbing detail lies in its theatricality. Unlike a swift beheading or hanging, the blood eagle was drawn out, designed for spectacle. Victims named in the sagas include King Ella of Northumbria, who had killed the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. Ragnar's sons, so the story goes, avenged him by carving the blood eagle on Ella's back, letting his agony mirror the dishonour of their father's death. Whether this was history or myth, the tale carried the weight of terror across the North Sea. Quirky tidbits about the blood eagle cling to language itself. Some scholars point to Old Norse poetry, where to carve an eagle on one's back may have been a metaphor for violent killing, not a literal description. In skaldic verse, the eagle often symbolised carrion birds feasting on the slain. Thus, the blood eagle could have been a poetic flourish, later misread by Christian chroniclers as a literal atrocity. And here lies the enduring debate. Scholars still debate whether the blood eagle was ever truly performed or whether it was a literary exaggeration turned into history. Some anatomists argue the act would have been nearly impossible without killing the victim instantly, undermining the saga's claim of prolonged suffering. Others counter that the Vikings, skilled in butchery, could have known enough anatomy to make the ritual plausible. The cover-up, if we may call it that, happened not in Viking times, but in the centuries after. As Scandinavia converted to Christianity, chroniclers emphasised Vikings' savagery to highlight the moral triumph of the new faith. The blood eagle was described in lurid detail, a warning of pagan cruelty. Later, Romanticism softened the image of the Viking into explorer and trader, downplaying the grotesque violence of such tales. Modern retellings, television dramas, novels, often dramatise the blood eagle, but even then, its reality remains edged in uncertainty. Yet the story endures. It is disturbing not only for its brutality, but for its symbolism. Lungs stretched like wings, flesh turned into emblem, suffering transformed into spectacle. Whether performed in some longhouse or only in the imagination of poets, the blood eagle embodies the Viking world at its most feared, where honour demanded blood and death itself was reshaped into a grotesque offering to the gods. China's terracotta mass graves. In the dry earth outside Xi'an, beneath fields that once belonged to farmers, lies one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the modern era, the terracotta army. Thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, complete with horses, chariots and weapons, stand in ordered ranks, guarding the tomb of China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. To the world, they are a wonder of artistry and engineering. But beneath their grandeur, the mausoleum hides something darker, the graves of those who built them. Mainstream history records that Qin Shi Huang, who unified China in 221 BCE, was obsessed with immortality. His vast tomb complex, still largely unexcavated, was designed to replicate his empire in miniature, rivers of mercury, palaces underground, and an army of clay to protect him in the afterlife. Contemporary chronicles, such as the records of the Grand Historian by Sima Qian, describe the scale of the project. Hundreds of thousands of labourers conscripted, artisans working for decades, and secrecy enforced with lethal rigour. The disturbing detail is that many of those who built the tomb did not live to see its completion. Sima Qian wrote that workers were sealed inside to prevent knowledge of the tomb's secrets from leaking. Archaeologists have uncovered mass graves near the pits, filled with human remains, showing signs of violent death. Some skeletons were bound, others hastily buried, suggesting they were executed once their labour was finished. The terracotta army may thus stand not only as guardians for the emperor, but as silent markers of the workers sacrificed for its creation. A quirky tidbit emerges from oral folklore. Some local villagers, long before the site was excavated in 1974, told stories of stone men buried beneath the earth who could come alive at night. They avoided digging too deep in certain fields, fearing curses. In a way, this folk memory carried the unease of generations, whispering of lives lost beneath the soil. Scholars still debate whether the mass graves are truly evidence of a systematic slaughter, or whether they reflect disease outbreaks and harsh working conditions. Qin's reign was infamous for forced labour on colossal projects, including the early Great Wall, where countless peasants perished from exhaustion and exposure. It is possible the tomb's mass deaths were the cumulative result of brutality rather than deliberate massacre. Yet the archaeological pattern, skeletons dumped together without ritual, suggests something more intentional. The cover-up came immediately after Qin's death. His dynasty lasted only a few years before rebellion swept it away, and subsequent rulers had little interest in preserving the image of the man who had declared himself first emperor. His tomb was left sealed, its dangers unspoken. For over 2 millennia, the earth above concealed both its splendour and its horrors. Even today, Chinese authorities hesitate to excavate the central chamber, citing preservation concerns, but also perhaps wary of what might be revealed, whether rivers of mercury truly flow there, whether the graves of countless workers still encircle their emperor. So the terracotta army stands in quiet rows, admired by tourists and scholars alike. Yet behind their painted eyes and sculpted armour lies a more haunting truth. They are not only guardians of an emperor's dream of eternity, but also monuments to the nameless dead who built them, silenced forever, so that Qin Shi Huang's afterlife could remain secure. The Mayan ball game of death. Deep in the jungles of Mesoamerica, stone courts still linger where the Maya once played their sacred ball game. The game, known as pok-to-pok, was not a casual pastime. Its courts were flanked by towering walls carved with scenes of warriors and gods, where rubber balls heavier than a human head were kept aloft by hips, thighs, and forearms alone. To the casual observer, it might resemble sport. But for the Maya, it was something far more disturbing, a ritual that often ended in death. Mainstream history tells us that the ball game carried profound religious significance. It reenacted the mythical struggle of the hero twins from the Popol Vuh, the Mayan creation story. In the tale, the twins played ball against the lords of the underworld, and through trickery and sacrifice, they triumphed, ensuring the renewal of life. Every match on Earth was, in effect, a reenactment of cosmic balance. To lose could mean death, not as punishment, but as sacred duty. The disturbing detail is who exactly died. Some carvings suggest it was the losing team that paid the ultimate price, their captains decapitated, their blood compared to the nourishing rains. Others hint it was the winners, offering themselves as the worthiest sacrifices. In either case, the game was not mere entertainment, but a ritual pathway to the gods, where skill and fate converged with mortality. Archaeology gives grim support. At Chichen Itza, one of the largest ball courts ever built, stone reliefs show ball players standing beside severed heads, streams of blood transforming into serpents. Skulls discovered in nearby pits suggest the game's losers, or perhaps its champions, were indeed dispatched after play. The court itself amplified the spectacle. Its acoustics carried the shouts and the thud of the ball across thousands of seats, turning ritual into theatre. A quirky tidbit from later Maya tradition complicates the story. Some communities continued to play the game after the Spanish conquest, stripped of its lethal stakes but retaining its sacred aura. In certain villages, it was said that the ball represented the sun itself, and keeping it aloft ensured cosmic order. Even today, in revived versions of the game, players speak of carrying forward a fragment of that ancient responsibility, though now without heads rolling on the sidelines. Scholars still debate whether every game ended in sacrifice, or only those tied to festivals and royal ceremonies. Some argue that depictions of death are symbolic, representing myth rather than actual execution. Others insist the combination of iconography and skeletal evidence leaves little doubt. For at least some matches, the conclusion was marked not by cheers, but by ritual killing. The cover-up came with the Spanish conquest. Missionaries denounced the ball game as pagan blood sport, outlawing it wherever they could. Colonial histories reduced it to superstition, erasing its cosmic significance. What survived in cultural memory was only fragments, the rubber ball, the stone courts, the faint echo of its deadly stakes. And so, when we walk today among the ruined ball courts of Copan or Chichen Itza, we see more than ancient sport. We see a theatre of mortality, where players risked not only victory or defeat, but the chance to embody gods, to feed the universe, and to die for the balance of all things. The Mayan ball game was a contest written in sweat and sealed in blood. Medieval Europe's dancing plague. In the summer of 1518, the streets of Strasbourg filled not with parades or markets, but with the sound of feet pounding stone, hundreds of them in frantic rhythm as if driven by some unseen drummer. It began with a single woman, Frau Trofea, who stepped into the square and danced without pause for days. Soon dozens joined her. Within weeks, hundreds of townspeople were caught in the same strange affliction, the dancing plague. It was a spectacle so disturbing that local authorities tried to conceal its extent, embarrassed that their city had become a theatre of madness. Mainstream accounts describe the phenomenon in detail. Contemporary chronicles record that dancers swayed, spun, and leapt until their bodies collapsed with exhaustion. Some reportedly died from strokes or heart failure. Unlike a festival, there was no joy in their movements. Faces were blank, limbs convulsed. The city council, baffled, attempted remedies, first hiring musicians to channel the frenzy, then banning music altogether, believing it fueled the contagion. Nothing seemed to help. The disturbing detail is how widespread these outbreaks were. Strasbourg's was not the only episode. From the 14th to the 17th centuries, reports of dancing manias appear across Europe, in Aachen, in Basel, in Cologne, sometimes involving thousands of participants. At the time, explanations ranged from possession by Saint Vitus, whose name became linked to the disorder, to divine punishment for sin. People were marched to shrines, whipped in penitential processions, or herded into barns to collapse. A quirky tidbit clings to the Strasbourg episode. Some dancers were said to laugh hysterically, others to scream, and still others to strip naked as they spun. One chronicler claimed a man continued to dance even after breaking ribs from repeated falls, pulled back into the rhythm as thus or by invisible strings. Such accounts blur the line between medical report and fevered gossip, but they underscore the uncanny grip of the phenomenon. Scholars still debate what truly caused the dancing plague. One theory blames ergot poisoning, the same fungus on rye bread that can induce hallucinations, the likely culprit behind witchcraft panics. Yet ergot typically causes violent spasms, not rhythmic movement, and it would not affect hundreds simultaneously. Another explanation suggests mass psychogenic illness, a kind of collective hysteria born of stress, famine, and fear, manifesting in bodily expression. In a time of plague and hardship, dance became a terrifying exorcism of despair. The cover-up came not so much in erasure as in reframing. By the 17th century, chroniclers softened descriptions, treating outbreaks as odd curiosities rather than civic embarrassments. Strasbourg's city records downplayed the deaths, preferring to highlight measures taken for public order. In later centuries the story was nearly forgotten, resurfacing only when modern historians pieced it together from dusty archives. Today, the dancing plague lingers on the edge of legend, half medical mystery, half cautionary tale. It unsettles because it blurs categories we prefer to keep neat: illness and ritual, hysteria and worship, body and spirit. In the heat of that summer, ordinary men and women found themselves compelled to dance without reason, without end, until their bodies gave out. And their city, unsure whether to laugh, pray or hide, chose instead to forget. The Inca's frozen child offerings, high in the Andes, where the air thins and mountains pierce the clouds, archaeologists have uncovered some of the most haunting remains of the ancient world, children sacrificed by the Inca and left upon icy peaks, preserved for centuries in snow and ice. Known today as the Capacocha rituals, these offerings were acts of devotion meant to sustain the empire and appease the gods. To modernize, they reveal a disturbing intersection of piety, politics, and innocence. Mainstream history tells us that the Inca, who ruled a vast domain across South America in the 15th and early 16th centuries, practiced Capacocha as part of their state religion. When drought struck, when an emperor died, or when the Inca sought to secure the god's favor, chosen children were led in solemn processions from Cuzco, the imperial capital, to mountaintop shrines. There, amid chanting and offerings, they were given alcohol or coca leaves before being ritually killed or left to succumb to the cold. The disturbing detail is the condition in which they are found today. In 1999, 3 such children, dubbed the Lulailaco mummies, were discovered at over 20,000 feet in Argentina. Their faces are serene, their hair neatly braided, their clothing richly woven. They look as if they simply fell asleep, untouched by centuries. Yet, forensic analysis revealed intoxicants in their systems, evidence that they had been sedated before death. The smallest, a 6-year-old girl, showed signs of having been struck on the head. The sacrifices were not only ceremonial, but calculated, designed to ease or enforce the passage into death. A quirky tidbit from Inca cosmology adds an unsettling layer. These children were not considered dead in the ordinary sense. They were believed to live on, serving as intermediaries with the gods, watching over the empire from their mountaintop terra. Villages whose children were chosen often treated it as an honor, even as parents wept. In their worldview, the sacrifice was both tragedy and transcendence. Scholars still debate the political dimensions of Capacocha. Some argue it reinforced imperial control. By selecting children from across conquered provinces, the Inca bound distant peoples into loyalty through shared grief and devotion. Others insist the ritual was primarily religious, a sincere attempt to maintain harmony with the cosmos, and still others question whether parents consented at all, or whether the state's demand was as coercive as its armies. The cover-up came with the Spanish conquest. Horrified missionaries condemned the sacrifices as barbaric, and Andean peoples, under pressure, folded the memory of Capacocha into silence. Mountain shrines were looted or forgotten. For centuries, the children lay hidden beneath snow, their story erased from colonial histories. Only modern archaeology, peeling back the ice, has restored their voices. Yet their presence is not easily absorbed into narratives of empire or piety. To gaze upon the preserved face of the Ice Maiden is to confront the disquieting reality that entire civilizations once sanctioned the death of their own children in the name of cosmic order. The Inca's empire, admired for its roads and masonry, carried within it a ritual core as chilling as the peaks where those children sleep. Japan's ubume legends. In the shadowed corners of Japanese folklore, few figures stir such quiet unease as the ubume, the ghost of a mother who died during childbirth. She appears not with thunder or fire, but with the fragile sorrow of unfinished duty. Pale and drenched in blood or wrapped in a burial kimono, she lingers near bridges and riverbanks, cradling an invisible infant. To encounter her is not to face rage, but grief so deep it bends the border between life and death. Mainstream tradition dates the ubume tales at least to the Edo period, 1603 to 1868, though their roots may stretch far earlier. Writers like Toriyama Sekien included them in his illustrated compendiums of yokai, Japanese spirits and monsters. In most accounts, the ubume approaches passers-by to beg for help carrying her child. Should someone accept, the child grows impossibly heavy, sometimes crushing the helper beneath its weight, before vanishing altogether. In other stories, the infant remains behind, a living legacy of the dead mother's desperate will. The disturbing detail is that the ubume reflects more than myth. In a time when maternal mortality was high, the anguish of women who died in childbirth was a familiar wound for families and communities. Graves of such women were sometimes treated with special rituals, for fear their restless spirits would wander. To name them, to give them narrative form, was a way of acknowledging sorrow too raw to otherwise speak aloud. A quirky tidbit lies in the cultural adaptation of the ubume. In later folklore, she was sometimes linked to protective roles. In certain villages, offerings of toys or sweets were left at roadside shrines, believed to house ubume, not only to soothe the spirit, but to ask her blessing for living children. The terrifying ghost thus shifted, in some tellings, into a guardian, a reminder that grief and care can emerge from the source. Scholars still debate whether the ubume is best understood as a specifically maternal ghost or as part of a wider tradition of hungry spirits in East Asia. Some argue she reflects uniquely Japanese attitudes toward motherhood, sacrifice, and the liminality of childbirth. Others suggest her traits, wandering by rivers, seeking offerings, echo broader Buddhist concepts of souls trapped in cycles of need. The ambiguity only deepens her haunting presence. The cover-up is subtler here. Unlike imperial decrees or erased inscriptions, the silencing of ubume stories came with modernization. As Japan industrialized in the late 19th century, folklore of ghosts tied to childbirth was downplayed, treated as superstition unfit for modern society. Hospitals replaced home births, urban life distanced families from ancestral graves, and the figure of the ubume receded into obscurity, resurfacing only in folktale collections and, later, in modern horror films. To remember the ubume is to glimpse a society's attempt to narrate what it feared most, the loss of a mother at the threshold of new life. She is less a monster than a mirror, showing us the persistence of love twisted by death into something spectral. On quiet nights in rural Japan, some still whisper of her presence, a woman in white, offering a child who grows unbearably heavy, carrying with her the unbearable weight of grief itself, the Greek curse tablets. In the dust of ancient wells, under temple floors, and buried in the walls of taverns, archaeologists have found thin sheets of lead, scratched with desperate, vengeful words. These are the Greek katadesmoi, or curse tablets, dark prayers meant to bind rivals, silence enemies, or twist fate itself. They were hidden away from sunlight, their power believed to grow in secret. To stumble across one today is to peer into the underside of classical civilization, where polished marble and lofty philosophy coexisted with whispered malice. Mainstream history places these tablets across the Greek world from the 5th century BCE onward. They turn up in Athens, in Corinth, and in colonies as far as Sicily. Often they are inscribed with names, invoking gods of the underworld like Hades, Persephone, or Hecate. Some call for a competitor in court to lose their voice mid-speech. Others target rival merchants, lovers, or athletes. The intent was clear: to bind the victim's will, body, or fortune until the curse was fulfilled. The disturbing detail is how personal and intimate they often are. One tablet reads not like lofty poetry, but like a jealous whisper. I bind Theodora, that she may never marry Demetrius. Another asks that a racehorse stumble at the starting line. Some even include dolls or figurines, pierced with nails, as if to physically lock the victim's spirit in suffering. In a culture famed for its democracy and art, here was the shadowed mirror, resentment etched into metal and consigned to the earth. A quirky tidbit emerges from the tablets found in wells. Scholars note that water was thought to connect directly to the chthonic realm. By dropping curses into cisterns, the petitioner was sending their words downstream to the gods of the underworld. Imagine, then, a bustling Athenian street where, beneath the chatter of merchants, curses slipped. Silently into the water everyone drank. Scholars still debate whether all curse tablets were made with genuine belief, or whether some were symbolic gestures, a way to vent rage without expectation of result. Were they acts of magic or psychological coping mechanisms in a world without courts of appeal for heartbreak and rivalry? The line between faith and theatre remains blurred. The cover-up was both deliberate and accidental. As Christianity spread across the Mediterranean, these tablets were condemned as witchcraft, their memory suppressed. Many were discarded or melted down. Only those deliberately hidden in wells and graves survived the centuries. Their rediscovery in modern archaeology exposed a side of antiquity the polished histories had left untold. To hold one now is to touch not only lead, but longing, anger, and desperation hardened into permanence. These were not stories meant to be read. They were secrets meant to stay buried, whispered only to the underworld. In uncovering them, we are reminded that the ancients, like us, carried grudges and jealousies, fears and wounds, and that even in ages of marble and glory, darkness was written into the very stones. Conclusion. Across 15 stories, we have traced the hidden undercurrents of ancient worlds. Rituals erased, whispers silenced, practices too disturbing for polite memory. From mountaintop sacrifices to dancing frenzies, from pharaohs struck from stone to mothers turned to ghosts, these tales reveal that beneath the triumphs of empire and the beauty of myth lay shadows just as profound. What unites them is not merely horror, but the human need to make sense of fear, loss and power through ritual, story or silence. When we uncover them, we do more than satisfy curiosity. We rejoin voices long buried. They remind us that history is never only about what was celebrated, but also about what was hidden, and that to understand who we are, we must listen to both the songs and the secrets of the past.